I'm joined by Sarah O'Carroll from our Cities and Governments team at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and Stella Chavin from our business team. So let's just jump straight into it with some questions. So this statement here, or these two statements, are what we're asking you to sort of pick from. One is, increasing recycling is a higher priority in any circular economy. Recycling is less important than maintaining products and components at high value at all times. What jumps out to you about those two statements?
Sure, yeah. I stand with the second statement. To me, I guess what bothers me with the first statement is that if we focus on recycling, it doesn't really challenge us to design differently and to think about the whole palette of solutions the circular economy framework offers. So you might think about maybe just changing materials so that they are recyclable, but this is only like a very small portion of all the different solutions and strategies that you could implement to be more circular. So if you focus on maintaining products and components...
What do we mean by maintaining products and components? What type of things are we talking about?
If you want to maintain a product, you might want to make it first durable, so choosing materials that will be more robust and last for a longer time, but you also might design it to be repairable. So you might think of making it dismantleable. For example, Gerard Street, which is headphone manufacturer, has created, not only they've innovated on the business model, but maybe we can touch upon this later, they've made their headphones so that they're easily dismantleable by the consumer, so that they can just send back the piece that is failing and replace it with another component. So instead of throwing away the whole product, you actually just replace one component.
Yeah, I completely agree that we should be definitely focusing efforts on designing products so that we can reuse them, repair them, and remanufacture them. And I think we see a lot of work being done by businesses and cities and governments alike to not only be thinking about recycling, but also to be thinking about how can we repair, reuse, and remanufacture products. I do think, though, that it's important to say that recycling is still part of our system, and after we have reused, repaired, and remanufactured products, at some point, recycling is still part of our solution space, and in many parts of the world, there just isn't the collection, sorting, and processing infrastructure needed for recycling to work. So when we cannot use a plastic material anymore, we don't want it to go to landfill, we don't want to incinerate it, we want to be able to recycle it. And that infrastructure, we still need a lot of investment in many, many places around the world for that to work.
And you both, I mean, I think some of the people might even find, some of the people watching the stream may even find those answers surprising, because in many ways the first thing you go to when people start talking about the circular economy is often, well, is it, or an assumption they might make, or a misconception they might have of the circular economy is, it's really just about how do we get stuff back to recycle, what do I need to put in my recycling bin? And you both jump straight to design, like actually at the other complete end of the other end of the spectrum, like how are we actually designing things differently?
Yeah. And it might be helpful to design for recycling, but where you'll retain the most value, as a product is manufactured, you embed energy, you embed labor, and all of this is all value on top of the material and of the product. So if you focus on designing it so that it can last for longer, but also be repaired before it is ultimately recycled, as you said, Sarah, you just retain much more value for longer.
Yeah. I think as well, if we think this way, when we are designing for recycling, it forces us, if we're thinking about how we design things and we're thinking about recycling as well, it makes us think about the materials that we're using in a product. And yes, is it repairable? Can I reuse this? Can I remanufacture it? But also at the end of the day, are those materials that we can recycle? So that we're thinking about kind of the whole product from beginning to end. Mm-hmm.
This, of course, is visualized in the Foundation's kind of semi-famous butterfly diagram, and you see the sort of loops on the technical side, which are all reuse, repair, remanufacture, and then recycling, we talk about it as being the loop of last resort. Yeah. We've used the word remanufacturing a few times some people watching a lot of people will be familiar, but just for anyone that isn't familiar, what do we mean by remanufacturing? And what is an example of remanufacturing even?
Well, I think when it comes to definitions, there are many different definitions, and refurbishment is another one that's quite tricky to perfectly define. But the idea is to put a product, and we're talking about a technical product, and often remanufacturing would be applied to machinery, quite heavy machinery, but a phone could be remanufactured as well. The idea is to put it back in its early state, so it has to be as good as new, and it is sold as a more attractive price to the consumer often if it's sold to a B2C in a B2C setting. But the idea is really that it operates as good as if it was new.
Yeah.
So really repairing it and looking at making it look also as good as new.
Yeah, so it's repaired and conditioned so that it's back to the original specifications of that product. And maybe some nice examples are Caterpillar. So Caterpillar is a heavy machinery company, and they're very well known for remanufacturing big heavy machinery parts so that they can be reused. Renault also does remanufacturing of car parts. And as Stella said, increasingly as well, we see phones being remanufactured so that they can be resold to the market.
So it really feels like we're really hitting on one of the core principles of the circle. One of the three core principles of we want to keep products and materials in use. Yeah. And fundamentally, recycling is about it doesn't keep it at its most valuable use or highest value use. Yeah. Obviously, at some stage, components or materials may need to be recycled, but that's why we're landing very strongly on recycling is less important than maintaining products and components. And maybe it's also, we had a lot of questions in the people who signed up for this session about what's the difference between circular economy and sustainability. And it feels like in some ways one of the core differentiating factors between maybe a traditional way of thinking about sustainability and this is, you start with design. It's about how do we actually look at this. In my intro I talked about a systemic framework. How do we look at the whole product? Yep. Shall we move on to the second statement? Maybe we get even more controversy between the two of you.
That wasn't controversial.
Very good agreement and alignment. Hope you didn't exchange notes before this session. So we're talking about design from waste here. And the question is regarding design initiatives that use waste materials and transform these into new designer products. Which statement do you identify with most? Designs from waste fit in a circular economy because they slow down the rate of waste creation, or designs from waste do not fit in a circular economy because they're ultimately downcycled.
I mean, do we want to just slow down the waste creation? To me, this is, to your last point, this is what sustainability is. Let's be sustainable, let's make it work as long as possible, but ultimately it just is going to collapse. I agree with the second statement. To me, designing from waste doesn't ultimately really fit in the circular economy. It's hard to tell what is waste, and is waste consistent? Can we make sure that a waste stream will always be the same type of materials, and so which will allow us to create products out of it? Or are we going to innovate constantly to find new solutions for those waste streams that keep evolving, that are always different? And are we just trying to put a band-aid on something that is just leaking, really?
I think we've seen some really beautiful examples, particularly from the craft industry and maybe the fashion industry as well, of how people have used waste materials to make beautiful new creations. But ultimately, to me, for lack of a better phrase, it feels like a wasted opportunity to be creating and designing a system which has waste. It doesn't seem particularly efficient. It doesn't seem an effective use of, as Stella said earlier, the energy, labor that goes into extracting these materials. And so I would also agree that I think the second statement definitely I agree more with. I think it also speaks to, again, going back to how we design things. And I think we've seen, particularly from the European Commission, how important the role of eco-design policies and product policies are becoming in transitioning the the European economy from a linear economy to a circular economy. And where initially we saw product policies that were very much focused around energy ratings, washing machines, refrigerators, stoves and things like that, that were spec'd based on an energy rating. We're now also seeing these products being spec'd based on eco-design criteria as well, how durable they are, how repairable they are, what materials have been used to make those products. And I think as well that we're going to see these expand to other categories like clothing and furniture as well. So I think we're already starting to see the second principle, second statement really take hold in economies.
And I suppose it's worth clarifying what we all understand what we mean by design from waste. People watching may not, and what we're kind of referring to this. And it's perhaps another common misconception or a common first thing that people start considering when they become sort of certainly aware of the problem of a linear economy, of the fact that we're taking lots of stuff out of the ground, making things out of it, and ultimately it's all becoming waste. The first thing they get fixated on is, well, what can I do with this waste?
Yeah.
But as you kind of say, Sarah, in what you were describing there, well, that kind of presumes that we're going to now design from that waste, and we assume that we accept it as a part of the system in the way we design the product.
Yeah. It doesn't encourage you to shift the mindset. It encourages you to think that waste is still part of the system, when ultimately we want to design out that waste and that concept of waste. So we shouldn't even think about designing from waste. Everything should be a material, and we should design consciously and pick those materials accordingly.
And it should be said that if you're designing a handbag using old sweet wrappers, that doesn't mean that's a terrible thing, and if people want to buy that, great, but it doesn't shift the system, and as you alluded, is it scalable? And actually, I personally don't want it, but no, I don't buy handbags either. So, but well done as well, Stella, for giving a shout out to another circular economy principle, design out waste and pollution, which is a really important semantic difference from what we're talking about here. Design out waste, not from waste. Okay, on to our next statement. Efficiency and effectiveness. So a circular economy only means an economy that slows down resource consumption because there is always material leakage. A circular economy is a regenerative economy that behaves like a forest. To feed itself, it feeds the individual tree, which in turn feeds the forest. So this is, I guess, the first statement kind of refers to this notion of how do we make things more efficient? How do we use less of things at times? And then the second statement talks about this almost idea that circular economy is inspired by nature.
Yeah. So
this is a trickier one, isn't it?
It's a tricky one. I've spent some time thinking about it and thinking about the session. And I think for me, efficiency is about doing things right, where effectiveness is about doing the right things. And there's a subtle difference there, that if we're doing things right from the start, we should inherently be more efficient in what we're doing. So
just talk about that nuance again. So it's doing things right or doing the right things.
Yeah. And so when you're doing things right, efficiency, to me, that feels like small incremental improvements over time, where being effective, if we're doing the right things, we're kind of getting it right from the start. So if we're thinking about the circular economy, we're thinking about the system. Instead of, if we take that first statement as an example, it's not material leakage. In material leakage, as we understand it now, is pollution and land degradation and things like that. It's material leakage. If it leaks, it is only natural capital building or regenerative to the natural system, restorative to the natural system. And so if we're doing things right from the start, if things don't end up exactly where they're supposed to, they shouldn't then be harmful to the environment, because you've kind of designed it so that it's not harmful from the beginning. Does that make sense?
It does.
It makes me think of Michael Braungart's old cherry tree example, which I use every time I'm in a session about circular economy. I bring this up because it's the story that I know. But this notion that, cherry trees, they blossom in the spring, loads of blossoms, they all fall down, but, there's maybe thousands of blossoms, and there's definitely not thousands of cherry trees growing from those blossoms. So it's clearly not an efficient process. It's in no way efficient, but
Yeah.
all those cherry tree little ecosystems build up around, and those blossoms and trees and things eat them, and well, they feed the
All
forest.
nourish, exactly. I've got an example that's helped me understand the difference between efficiency and effectiveness that is quite counterintuitive, and it's in the technical cycle. So, for example, if you're designing a plastic bottle, let's say a PET bottle, to be effective, you don't want it to be used only once, you'd want to reuse it. And so you might actually have to put more material in it and more plastics, but ultimately this enables it to be reused plenty of times. So the bottle that is thinner and has less material is an efficient way of producing a bottle, but actually the bottle that is a bit more robust has more material in it, but it is effective because it will be reusable for 30, 50 times. And so this is, to me, the difference between efficiency and effectiveness.
It's
What
not
is the
about
end
just
point?
doing less and less and less
Exactly.
and having less. It's about appreciating the abundance that actually exists. And it echoes very much the kind of the final principle of the circular economy. We're doing it in record time, which is the idea of regenerating natural systems, which I think is sometimes the principle that at least when I talk to people, it's the one that is the hardest to intuitively get. Design out waste and pollution, understand, keep materials in use, yeah, get it. Regenerate natural systems a little bit trickier, and I think it does come to this sort of efficiency versus effectiveness question.